Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about things that I think we need to talk about. Today, in this episode, we need to talk about Syria. Um, so I want to discuss some of what's been happening. So, beginning with a sort of history of the Assad dynasty, which has just fallen, a short dynasty in terms of number of leaders that came from the dynasty, just two, but it was in power for 54 years. And then I want to run through how things changed since 2011, the rise of the Islamist opposition that has uh, taken power currently. Um, and then I want to have a look at what's happening on the ground and some of the um, implications, for example, with Israel's actions against Syria at the moment and the diplomacy that's happening with the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham who've taken over or taken over, have become the hegemonic power, it seems. They seem to be the ones who are aiming to be the government going forward, um, even though the country is split, of course. So having a look at that, seeing what it means, which is generally, I'm not going to lie, it's not looking great for the future. Regardless of how poorly things go for minorities within Syria going forward, there are other issues, but I'll get to that later. And then I want to zoom out and look more from a perspective of imperialism, looking at the long conquest of the Middle East and, well, of the Arab world, particularly the Middle East, but also the North African Arab world by the United States that began in 1944, which has involved a certain amount of adopting people as client states, effectively taking them under the wing but dominating them, and a certain amount of military intervention directly and through proxies. This, to me, is very reminiscent of the mid to late 18th century takeover of the Indian subcontinent by the British under the guise of the British East India Company, and uh, they too fought wars against local despots, demonized local despots, and I think if we have a look at I want to use Tipu Sultan as an example. If we have a look at his reputation, uh, his role, and stepping back with a couple of centuries distance to help us understand things, to kind of put into perspective what the real important issues are in this. And then I just want to probably finish maybe with a rant about people um, becoming self-righteous and bullying people about, whether they're an Assad apologist because they don't agree with a certain line. Uh, you know, so I'll discuss that because there is actually, I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There is more to it than that. There are many ways in which our ideologies lead us into supporting the insupportable, and we have to always guard against following what we might think is a moral line and deciding to ignore certain aspects in order to keep following that line, and then find that we're actually advocating for completely immoral actions and purposes. So anyway, to start with the history, so the Syria was the birthplace of the Ba'ath Party, which is an Arab nationalist socialist party, and largely secular. Now, what it was founded by two people, one of whom was a Christian, but it does kind of acknowledge Islam as being central to the Arab identity. So it does have a kind of pro-Islam slant to it, and you can see certainly, like, as he got in more and more trouble, Saddam Hussein, who also was a Ba'athist leader, although at odds with the Syrian Ba'ath party, he leaned more into an an Islamic identity as a way of garnering support for himself. So it's almost secular and, in theory, socialist as well. When Hafez al-Assad became the president of Syria, he instituted, or those around him instituted, more of a cult of personality. So Syria, under the Ba'ath Party, had been a kind of one-party state, with the sort of apparatus you'd expect from that sort of thing. And then it kind of morphed into more of a dictatorial system, with this central figure being plastered everywhere, as uh, the beloved leader sort of thing. So also, along with this went the growth of a sort of Alawi supremacy. Now, the Alawi are a sect of Islam, often considered Shia, but there is some there is a little bit of disagreement over that. So they have traditionally been secretive, and they are an esoteric sect, and they are different. They differ from other forms of Islam in some significant ways, including not fasting at Ramadan, for example. And there's elements of syncretism in their religion as well, in that they maybe not borrowed beliefs, but have like rituals borrowed from Christianity, that they have repurposed to a different religious belief. So they are not Orthodox Muslims, and to the extent that there is such a thing as orthodoxy, because there's very diverse religion. They differ from others. They have, it sounds like they have in recent years been normalizing some practices more with Islam, so that the distance is closing somewhat. They were the leaders. They were a privileged group, particularly in terms of power, I think, rather than wealth, although obviously the two go together. So they were very prominent in the Syrian Air Force. They also basically ran the security and intelligence services, which is, of course, incredibly important. Now, often there would be a Sunni figurehead at the leading these organizations, but they would be the key positions would be taken by Alawi. So there was a pretense. They maintained the pretense of secularism while having this network, but it wasn't like an apartheid regime or anything like that. It's more maybe akin to the way Saddam Hussein used Sunni people in high positions, because they formed a familiar network. Often these Sunni people were from tribal backgrounds in northern Iraq that coincided with Saddam Hussein's own background. So it's not necessarily I mean, of course, there can be elements of chauvinism in it, but it is more of a way of consolidating power with a singular identity. Now, Hafiz al-Assad, he also he had a brother called Rifat al-Assad who was notoriously corrupt. Um, uh, in 1982, there was a Muslim Brotherhood uprising, and at Hafiz al-Assad's orders, Rifat al-Assad conducted a massacre in Hama, mainly conducted with ground artillery, shelling the city to destroy the uprising, which had popular support, but essentially shelling civilians, killing perhaps around 20,000 people. So quite brutal when called upon to be brutal. Hafiz al-Assad instituted some economic liberalization and other reforms, not necessarily a lot. His brother Rifat was seen as a potential successor, although the Ba'ath Party reacted to this, or some in the Ba'ath Party thought that was a strange thing to happen because they're a political party with a socialist ideology, not not a monarchy. So there was some resistance to that idea, and then Rifat, when Hafez fell ill, tried to conduct a coup and was exiled anyway. So Hafez's eldest son, Basil or something like that, was then nominated as the successor. He died. So Bashar al-Assad, who was working as a dentist or orthodontist in France at the time, I believe, was brought back to Syria, put in the army to learn the trade of being a leader or whatever it was, and sort of groomed to take over. And while he was being in the army, learning to be an officer, they were also working on the Ba'ath Party to accept him as the future leader. So in 2000, Hafiz dies. Bashar takes over, of course, this is not long before the global war on terror breaks out. In the first war that the US conducted against Iraq, the so-called Gulf War, the Syrians had supported the US, and coincidentally, perhaps, I don't know, they had enjoyed some economic good times in the early to mid-90s thereafter. But when the global war on terror broke out, the situation was a little bit more ambiguous. Syria was used as a site of torture by the CIA. So it was involved in the CIA's extraordinary rendition program and torture program. So it cooperated on that level. However, publicly, the public-facing part of Syria opposed the invasion of Iraq. The economy, again, it could be. There were neoliberal reforms in the economy, and the economy also suffered in other ways. So both of these things started to hit the rural people in particular, and create poverty and discontent in the country. In 2006, Colin Powell visited Syria, and we're told, to the extent you can ever trust any diplomacy as being revelatory of anything at all, but we are told he gave Bashar al-Assad an ultimatum to stop supporting Hezbollah and the Palestinians, or he would be next. And as we know, of course, the US had already set its sights on Syria. So, I mean, whether this was, a message that either of them believed, I don't know. But what happened was that Syria became a conduit for jihadis to enter into Iraq for resistance in general. But I mean, in the end, it was Islamist jihadis entering into Iraq. Now, I think that I'd imagine that Bashar al-Assad thought at the time that they would be creating a quagmire for the US, which would be protective for them, for Syria, I mean, and at the same time, perhaps even exhausting these the Islamists who would die fighting the foreign invader. That is not what happened, of course, and in fact, I'd imagine the move was very welcomed by the US, who needed the political cover of having jihadi Islamists coming into the country to justify their continued occupation against the very clear will of all of the indigenous parties in Iraq, with the possible partial exception of those in Kurdistan. So, so in fact, I think that both the Assads, like Saddam Hussein, were very convenient enemies for the US. They, in choosing to institute iron, cult of personality and strongman rule in these countries, they may have given themselves the feeling that they were getting rid of opposition, when, of course, what you do when you do that is you drive opposition underground, so it's no longer visible, but you make your own popularity extremely fragile, which is something we could see might have not paid off in the long run for Bashar al-Assad. But also, it is a gold-plated gift to the United States, diamond-encrusted gift, I should say. Once they start being dictatorial, once they start down the road of trying to enforce ideological conformity with violence and with ham-handed sort of cult of personality propaganda, then it's very easy for the US to paint them as an enemy that needs to be, that can legitimately be attacked for the benefit of their own people, which is really an untenable position in this world today. Once you have let that door open, then the US will exploit it. So Colin Powell's ultimatum, well, in the end, whether it has to do with whether Assad really had a chance to choose to distance himself from Hezbollah and the Palestinian cause, whether that would have saved his country or not, I don't know. But what happened was, of course, there was the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring gave the opportunity to do an impromptu sort of colour revolution sort of attempt in Syria. So exploiting real discontent, of course, which is often, just because an imperial power is trying to overthrow your regime, it doesn't mean your regime is nice. And people might have very real reasons for wanting to get rid of it. So this failed, was repressed. But I think there's good indications that actually the a lot of the Syrian people understood pretty quickly that this is really a threat from the outside. It's foreign interference and it's unwelcome Islamist militias that were destabilizing the country. And the reason I say that is because there seems to have been a bit of a rally round the flag situation for Assad and his popularity. So the evidence I have of that is that they had presidential elections in 2014. Now, there's not particularly democratic elections because they're very restrictive on who can run. So the winner is more or less inevitable. It was always going to be Bashar al-Assad. But the thing is that they had, at this stage, there were many refugees and a lot of expatriate Syrians voted around the world. And the turnout is really the thing that indicates the popularity here. So the turnout was, not insubstantial. A lot of people wanted to come and cast a vote for Bashar al-Assad. They didn't have to. There's no makabarat where they were. And equally telling is the fact that enemies of the regime would not allow local Syrian consular or officials to allow to collect votes. So the enemies of the Syrian government did not feel confident enough to let this happen and then say, look, no one's voting because they all hate Assad. They knew that a lot of the refugees were actually in favour of the government, or at least loyal. No, maybe they didn't like the government, but they considered they were loyal to it as a patriotic thing in the face of overseas interference. So one of the more recent propaganda takes that we have seen coming out of the Western media and Al Jazeera also is the idea that that all the refugees were trying to imply that the refugees were refugees because they were fleeing the oppression of the government, even though the chronology shows very clearly that they were fleeing the outbreak of civil war. So they've created this narrative that they're all trying to flood back into the country, even while it's in a very unstable state. And Craig Murray went to the border to check to see if that was the case and found that there was definitely not a flood, there was a trickle. And I mean, there must be people desperate to get back for various reasons, but you would hardly, at this stage, with Israel bombing and invading with no certainty, there's no reason, regardless of your ideology, that unless there was some particular family-based need or something like that, why anyone would rush back, especially knowing that that they won't be allowed to leave again. And also, I want to point out that those countries, including European countries, I'm assuming other Western countries will follow suit, as well as countries neighbouring Syria that have decided that there can be no refugees now because the evil, nasty dictator is gone, and therefore everyone must be very happy now. That is an inhuman, cruel behaviour, because many people are at risk of possible forms of communitarian violence or political repression at the hands of the HTS or other actors, and there are plenty of them as well. None of them with records that you should rely on 100% to behave in a pure humanitarian way. So, so the popularity jumped with this kind of perception, well, with the Civil War, basically, but it presumably has declined considerably since. The country has been under like a, a very um, broad attack on many fronts to turn it into a non-viable state. And I think one of the reasons things were folded up so quickly was that there was no real way forward. I'll get to that in a bit, but the it had been sanctioned. The part of the country that had the best uh, um, fields for growing wheat had been occupied by the US. The oil fields were occupied by the US. It was regularly bombed by Israel. It lacked money and food and fuel. It lacked everything. The army was so poorly paid that they couldn't support their families. Um, it, any regardless of how much you might want to be loyal to your country, that sort of thing is going to wear on you. Um, and Yeah, I mean, I think also that there will have been a lot of covert action, a lot of attempted subversion, and so forth. And of course, the um, the Assad regime, of course, is going to play right into that by becoming extremely repressive, which they did inevitably. So, how much we can believe about the atrocities that we hear. Well, that's the weird thing because it doesn't matter how bad the atrocities of the Syrians were, the Western media will still make up lies. This is the sort of rule that they follow because they want to make sure that they create this idea of a qualitative difference between their side, the side they support, and the other side. So we saw this, for example, with the number of civilians killed in the Al Aqsa flood operation. They weren't, you might not think that it makes a lot of difference to say 1,500 instead of 800, but in fact you can leverage that extra for more. So expect that a lot, in fact, don't believe what you hear. Believe that atrocities happened, but do not believe what, particularly the things that actually make you most disturbed and angry, are likely to be concocted. The reality of oppression in Syria is probably um, cruel but banal and familiar from other places, such that, for example, there's probably very little that happened in Damascus prisons that didn't happen in Idlib prisons under the HTS, where people are right now still suffering. So, yes, it's good that people are being let out from these prisons in one place, but we should need to bear in mind that that does not end suffering in Syria by any means. So the one of the techniques of empire which the US deployed here was specifically choosing the figurehead, who again conveniently has made himself the kind of leader figure, in this case Bashar al-Assad, and making him out to be a particular demonic psychopath. Now this is an old practice. The British loved this sort of thing, and if people were actually cruel and barbarous, well and good. If they weren't, it didn't matter. They would still demonize them as being the uh, what we have now. The modern version of it is the Hitler of the Month Club, and each successive enemy is elevated at the time in the media as being sometimes worse than Hitler, as George Bush Senior said about Saddam Hussein. So um, um, again, like this shows it's actually an interesting thing to show the bad faith sort of with which they engage these ideas, and the reason for saying that that Saddam Hussein was worse than Hitler was that Saddam Hussein used gas and Hitler didn't use chemical weapons, which is a very strange thing to say about someone whose people used cyanide gas to kill, around 1 million people. But he's just exploiting a loophole that, like, Hitler didn't use chemical weapons on the battlefield because the political ramifications would be terrible, and because chemical weapons are quite ineffectual often. And to exploit that to say that Saddam Hussein was worse than Hitler. And speaking of chemical weapons being ineffectual, I also have to point out that you're not an Assad apologist if you say he didn't use chlorine to gas his own people. It has been debunked, but it shouldn't have even needed to be debunked because chlorine gas was was obsolete in 1915, and this is a government that had access to fighter jets and helicopter gunships, and the idea that they would use something as primitive and imprecise and as chlorine gas is quite silly, really. If they wanted to use chemicals, they would have come up with something else. Chlorine gas, of course, would be very consistent with a non-state actor trying to stage what looks like a government chemical attack, and that is, in fact, what happened. That doesn't make me an Assad apologist. You can look it up. I'm not saying it because I like Baathism or whatever. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end. This is totally nothing to do with my ideology. It's just about the facts. So yes. So they do like to create these figures of hate figures, and they do it with exaggerating atrocities. They also try and provoke atrocities, and obviously the repression and the destabilization has done that to some extent in Syria. And there are some interesting stories, like to illustrate the US love of provoking atrocities and others. So one of them is that in the late 1940s and 50s, they used intelligence assets to frame innocent people in the Soviet Union or the behind the in the Soviet-dominated sphere, so that to provoke them into uh, arresting people and torturing confessions out of them, and then doing show trials and executing them. In a repeat of the show trials they had conducted in the 1930s. So, and this, I'm sure, was considered quite a coup because it made the Soviets look very brutal. But of course, in reality, the CIA was just as brutal. They were just as guilty of taking innocent people, and even though it wasn't their hands, they knew exactly what was going to happen to them. So they are culpable, yet they the guilt, the negative publicity certainly affects the Soviets more than the CIA. And in another instance, disturbingly like that, a guy called Robert Baer, who was a CIA officer, who was a Farsi speaker, and became a bit of an icon for liberals. He wrote in his book "See No Evil" that he had almost succeeded in managing to con the Syrian government into conducting another massacre such as the one that happened in Hama. Now, Robert Baer is the model for the main character in the film Syriana, the main character played by George Clooney, who's meant to be this kind of urbane, non-war hawkish, sort of more internationalist model of a CIA officer, in contrast to the violent, thuggish, neocons of this world. Hence why he was beloved of liberals. But he didn't seem to think that there was, in the book, he's not saying this with shame. He didn't seem to think that him trying to get thousands of innocent Syrians killed was a bad thing to do. And so you kind of realize that, like, he might be the more urbane, cosmopolitan, non Bible Belt sort of guy, as opposed to sort of the persona that George W. Bush, the Texan sort of God-loving, Bible-thumping guy that George W. Bush pretended to be. But really, there's not really much distance between them, and neither of these people really view the Syrian people any more than the Iraqi people as fully human. They see them as, as someone once said recently, I think, talking about Syria, as gnats to be wiped off, whenever you need to. So I think that's it's a bit of a foreshadowing of where I'm going to go when I talk about imperialism shortly. But it also shows how much the US values making the other side into the baddie by encouraging them to commit atrocities. And then, as I said, they also will exaggerate them. So now, so what's happened in the last, how long would it be? There's been the involvement of Salafi Islamist groups from the beginning of the Civil War, and there's been like this kind of the pretend secular side of the resistance to the Assad regime, which is kind of dropped away now, and so we do have this Islamist-led group, possibly leading a coalition and looking towards forming a government. Now, the leader, obviously we know him as Abu Muhammad al-Jilani. This is a nom de guerre, and al-Jilani means he's someone from Golan, which is where his family comes from. And so he seems to be now the the leader. Who knows what sort of structure or constitution is going to arise out of this? But of course, the question is, how tolerant are these Islamist forces going to be of other religions and other sects? So the Alawis are sufficiently unusual, like the Yazidis, in that it's hard not to fear for their future, and a lot of people refer to the forces, these Salafi forces. Salafi more or less meaning, we'll just say fundamentalist, whatever, but fundamentalist, and in this case Islamist as well. So it's not just a religious belief. Salafis can just have a religious belief and it's not political, but these people are Islamists, so that means that their belief is part of their politics as well. In this instance, enough that they're willing to pick up guns and kill people for it. So these are Salafi Islamists, and the question is, are people right to also call them takfiris? Takfiris are people who see other sects of Islam other than Sunni Islam as apostates and therefore subject to being killed. Yeah. Well, apostates or heretics, either way. So it is worrying, but we don't know what's going to happen with that. There have been, there've been noises made that they will not conduct communal violence against people because of their religious and sectarian identity. So we'll wait and see. What we do know, though, is that there are things that have happened that are absolutely disastrous for Syrian sovereignty. So Israel has destroyed their navy and has taken over chunks. Turkey has taken over other chunks. Syrian sovereignty, in the best case scenario, it doesn't really look like they can throw together a state that could in any way choose to exert its own self-determination if Israel, for example, or the US or Turkey, any of them really chooses to say you're not allowed to do something. So they will not have the strength to control their own region, the area, the territory within their own borders independently, regardless of what happens, regardless of whether all of the groups, all of the various armed groups all decide to sort of fall in line, which I think is unlikely anyway. So Syrian sovereignty is currently non-existent, and it will take a change in circumstances for it to come back. As Ali Abu Nima said, no Palestinian, for example, would fear Syrian sovereignty because we know that the Syrian people will stand with the Palestinian people if given freedom of action. So, by inverse logic, it is inimical to Zionism to allow Syria to reconstitute its sovereignty and to be able to exert any form of power in the region again. So this is clearly the effect on the Palestinian people and the Lebanese people as well is going to be very detrimental, having lost the potential counterweight on its border for even a reasonably weakened and embattled Syria provided some form of counterweight there. A little bit of constraint on the Zionist politics. I was going to say the Zionist entity. I don't know whether I should use that sort of language. But yeah, the actions of Zionists, the actions of the Israeli government, they constrain their foreign policy. So the other thing, though, is the role of the USA in this, because let's face it, Turkey is a client of the US, and so is Israel, and to the relationship with the Islamists, who the names, of course, keep changing. These are all people, they have split and reformed and rebranded and so forth. These are all people who came out of Al-Qaeda in the first place. And Al-Qaeda, before it was the enemy of the United States, it got its name because it was Al-Qaeda was the base, and it referred to a database of Islamist militants that were considered assets by the U.S. intelligence, either witting or unwitting assets, and particularly in their fight to against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So the friend-enemy relationship between the US and these Islamists, who can be called Al Qaeda, they can be called ISIS, they can be called Jabhat al-Nusra. The names change all the time, and there are splits. They're not just random name changes. There might be splits, and organisations may have a certain amount of disagreement, but they all share a common origin, and their significance to the US is very similar in that they are the right sort of enemy to have when you want, and the right sort of ally to have when you want as well, because they have been both. And we have heard for years now the talk of good Al-Qaeda as being like this Western-friendly version that hates Iran more than it hates the US and so forth. So we have this long-standing thing with these Islamists that they, of course, must show hatred of the US, and the US must show hatred of them, but at the same time they can drop it sometimes and choose to be all friendly, and the relationship is much closer and more symbiotic in terms of for example, the US actions in Libya, freeing up both Islamists in Libya, but also providing supply of arms to Islamists in Syria and Iraq, and also, of course, the US client state, Saudi Arabia, one of its kind of most established clients, one of its, most, I would say, loyal clients. Obviously, people don't see it that way, but that's Saudi Arabia. They are key to allowing these Islamist groups to thrive and prosper. So now we have one of them taking over a whole country. We've kind of seen this before with the sudden rise of the Islamic State, sort of setting up a country out of nowhere. So there is a little bit of a precedent here, and we can also look at the precedent in Libya to see that there's very likely that we might end up with more than one government, for example. chronic instability, and that chronic instability will become a zone of opportunity for further degradation of Syria and Syrian wealth, plundering of Syrian wealth, not necessarily for the sake of profit, but for the sake of depriving a potential strategic rival of their power to rebuild later. And at the same time, you reduce their negotiating position, of course, of if there should there arise an anti-imperial resistance, which there will eventually, obviously. The more desperate they are, the more room you have to manoeuvre when you're negotiating with them. In other words, you basically use methods of genocide to weaken the people as such, weaken the nation of Syrians as such, through distraction, impoverishment, and so forth. And then it gives you numerous advantages at the price, of course, of being brutally inhuman and not really worthy of even being in our species any longer. Now, in the long run, the biggest problem for the whole region is the United States. We can look at Israel, but of course, Israel is only a problem as long as the US allows it to be. They can turn off the tap anytime they want. Lots of people have said this over time, and we need to remember it every time we talk about this. Israel is a wholly owned subsidiary of the US empire. It cannot act independently. So when we talk about the the threat in the region, this is number one. The US is as Martin Luther King said it a long time ago, 60 years ago now, nearly 60 years ago. It is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Still is. It has been since the end of World War II. There are people who would like to attribute greater violence to communists, but that is a little bit of they do so through by some unreasonable methodologies, whereas the US is involved in so many of the mass casualty events and mass atrocities since World War II, either directly through actually perpetrating them, and that's these are not small things. So, for example, the Korean War, millions died, and the US killed most of them through carpet bombing, shelling, destruction of dams, creating starvation, and so forth. Now, I don't have time to go into the rights and wrongs of that war at the moment, but I'd also consider the US to be the aggressor and the cause for that war in the first place. So, and then we have the First Indochina War, which was when the French were fighting against the liberation of Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, which became like an American war as they became the main financiers of the French efforts and started directing the French in what they were to do. And then the Second Indochina War, which they were wholly responsible for they were the outright aggressors, having created, partitioned the country in the first place, and acted to prevent a political solution to that, and having sent many attacks against North Vietnam. The resultant deaths can all be laid at their door. So that is millions. They killed hundreds of thousands in Cambodia. And then there's an interesting phenomenon, of course, because the Khmer Rouge was created out of their violence. Now, the Khmer Rouge, the US in some ways can't be held responsible for what they do, but there is a level to which they are culpable as well, having both. Because the US bombed the agricultural land, the countryside, to an incredible degree and drove a lot of people as refugees into Phnom Penh. The Khmer Rouge rose up as this rather brutalized, often and a very young group of insurgents fighting against the US-backed government, who were highly brutalized and became very brutal and were led by a, quite frankly, rather insane regime, which caused a lot of starvation because of the extremity of their policies and the refusal to accept outside aid. But that starvation was in part, that did happen in part because of the US bombing in the first place. So they do bear a certain amount of culpability for that, as they do for the slaughter in Rwanda as well, because they were responsible for the destabilization of Rwanda under Paul Kagame's Rwandan Patriotic Army. That again, scoured a lot of the countryside, sending a lot of people to become refugees in Kigali. So in some ways, the powder keg looked a little bit similar to Cambodia. So there bear some culpability for that, and also more culpability for that then expanding into the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which they, obviously they had played a big role in overthrowing the the institution of dictatorial rule in Zaire / Democratic Republic of Congo, and then the destabilization, and then their own clients from under Kagame going in and further destabilizing, leading in the long run to millions and millions of deaths. And you can add to that, you can add Guatemala, you can add Indonesia, 500,000 to 1 million deaths. The list goes on and on and on. I mean, if we use the sort of methodology that the victims of communism people do, then you would just it would become astronomical. So they are the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And so they are also the biggest problem. And I think this is in part because this is intrinsic to blue water empires. Blue water empires are, the product of modernism. Maybe the most symptomatic part of modernism in some ways. The birth of empires which were based on far-flung conquests, often using disparities in technological abilities to create conquests. You have obviously Jared. Is it Jared Diamond? I'm not sure. The guns, germs, and steel sort of thesis, where that it really, which there's some truth to it anyway. That they had these European powers had these advantages which came from in part their distance and the firstly, the different pathogens that they brought with them, but also the different resources they had because they came from a different region, and the different technological development they had access to because they were part of the Eurasian continent and therefore had a um, far wider access to the technological development, not much of which actually came out of South Asia and East Asia, of course, and the Middle East. So um, um, the, there's blue water empires. I think that in European history, part of the origins of that goes back to the Crusader states, where the Europeans got the idea in their head, which can actually be seen as a little bit of a Zionist idea coming up, because they believed in the promised land. So these Christians have a part of obviously it's derived from Judaism. So the idea of the promised land in Jerusalem, which has been restated in various ways as sometimes belonging in other places or whatever, but Jerusalem was central to medieval theology, and it was the promised land. And so with that kind of Christian version of the Zionist impulse, they went and conquered it, but of course that at a distance. Which created a weird dynamic, because you would have the people living there who would become effectively creolized, and they would start to intermarry and sort of start to learn the local languages and stuff. But you would have this influx of fanatics, chauvinist fanatics, who came in with extreme violence coming into these crusader states. And I think that some of that attitude, which would also come through the Reconquista in Spain, which of course finished in 1492, just in time for the discovery of the New World. This would start to fuel attitudes, racial attitudes of extreme alienation and hatred or dehumanization. Now, I might as well distinguish now between animus and dehumanization. Animus is where you look at someone and you loathe them, you have a negative reaction to them, and dehumanization is when you devalue them. So history has shown us that it's the latter that is far more dangerous, actually. The two tend to go together, but once you start, especially when you start building a blue water empire, the people at the other end, if they stop seeming like humans to you, then, well, that's when they start to die in their millions. And this is really why I'm saying that this is maybe the most important thing about the fall of Syria. Not that it stands alone, it's part of a series of conquests, but history in a couple of centuries' time will look back on it, and they're not going to care about how much of a bad guy Bashar al-Assad was. Well, they might do, but they probably shouldn't. The nature of blue water empires is that they start to create a constituency that is not tied to the interests of the people in the periphery, the conquered people, but is also not tied to the interests of the people in the centre. This is why you ended up with the people in Spain first and then Britain later ending up as the poorest people in Europe, the ordinary working people, because the imperial interests were able to function in an imperial setting that basically did not have to serve the interests of people at either end of the empire. It became its own system. Now, blue water empires create these forms of animus and dehumanization that are dangerous, and they have led to the worst worst atrocities in history. And I say that in part because I think there are some exceptions that sort of prove the rule. So, for example, the US conquest of North America, which was just as brutal as the Spanish and Brazilian conquest of South America. It may not have killed as many people, but it was still the same thing. A process that took a long time and was of repeated acts of genocidal massacre or displacement and so forth. Genocide, basically. Of course, it's not a blue water empire. Once the government is in Washington, it's not a blue water empire. This is a land empire. But the attitudes came from the blue water empire. The identity difference, the cultural, ethnic, and political gulf between the indigenous people and the settlers was the same. And like if like the Iroquois Confederacy, for example, had taken over the entirety of North America, it would have looked very different and been much less bloody and much more assimilative. And another instance I think that is very instructive is the Third Reich, because they copied the methods and ideologies of blue water empires and their attitudes. And in a way, with their rapid expansion, with blitzkrieg, with armored warfare, and so forth, in a way, the kind of cultural distance became as great, and the behaviors were similar. So yeah, I mean, and of course, the other thing about blue water empires is they have their informal empire aspect or their near-colonial aspect as well. And obviously, having an army invade is terrible, but it is also not good to be subject to neo-colonial control. The interests of the imperial elite of the empire system are antagonistic to the development of the local population because that would reduce their control. So they need to maintain weakness, poverty, and cruel conditions of life in order to maintain their grip over a neo-colonial client state. So I would say that in many respects, a local despot is in some ways more democratic than an elected comprador leader. So if someone is in contested pluralistic elections, but the economy of their country is controlled by an imperial power, they are going to be less responsive to the needs of their people than a brutal dictator would. And that's a sad reality of it. And that is by no means, again, I'm not an Assad apologist and I'm not a brutal dictator apologist. I'm just trying to put things into perspective here. So the conquest of the Arab world does look a lot like the conquest of the Indian subcontinent by the British in the mid to late 18th century. The first thing that happened was that that Roosevelt went to the Saudis, who'd been set up by the British to be a kind of client monarchy in the first place, and more or less detached them from the British and took over and said, you're our client monarchy. Don't worry, we'll look after you. Now, one of the things about that sort of system, and this is no different from the system that the US ran in Latin American countries, is that what you do is you make yourself friends with the rulers who might have a minority identity for example. Uh, so, the US aligned themselves with a Christian in Korea and in Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, and they both had political constituencies that came from this minority, not dissimilar, perhaps in some ways, to the Alawi um, system in Syria, or Saddam Hussein's Sunni tribal connections. So monarchies are useful. I think this is why the British chose to set up monarchies in the Arabian in the Middle East. Sorry, because they can they don't necessarily represent the views of their people. It's possible to keep the rulers at odds with the people, and for the US, of course, it's very similar with military dictatorships, which they even had situations such as in El Salvador under Duarte, you had elections and someone elected, but the military is so powerful that the person elected is more or less elected as the figurehead for a military dictatorship. So in the military, they make sure that the military is both loyal and dependent on the US by sending them. In the British instance, the princes would all go to Sandhurst. In the US instance, all of the military people, military officers, the promising ones, would go to Fort Benning, and so forth. And then you supply arms, and you make sure that there's always a need for arms. So if there's an insurgency, a restless minority such as the Shia in Saudi Arabia, then it means that there's always a very strong incentive for the client to remain loyal to the imperial power. So in the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company would uh, create client relationships with smaller polities run by um, uh, princelings, whatever you want to call them, and they would use that as a kind of a way of um, recruiting troops and allowing ways of projecting power um, into the larger polities, um, and they would eventually attack them. So one of the places they attacked was Mysore. Uh, they had 4 wars against Mysore, um, and they lost the first 2 very decisively. And I think there is a very important lesson to learn here about blue water empires as well. They have a major advantage that has nothing to do with guns, germs, and steel. The distance means that they have a safe center that cannot be attacked by the other party. So, people say that the US lost the war in Vietnam, but they didn't lose it in the sense that someone would lose a war to them. There were no Vietnamese troops marching into Washington. There was no dictating of terms. There was an agreement made, and the US immediately just wiped their ass on it and said, "No, we're not going to fucking do that." You know, they were supposed to pay reparations, which anyone with any knowledge of what had happened there would think, well, that's of course you should. But in fact, they didn't, and Jimmy Carter would later say that he didn't think that there should be any reparations because the destruction was mutual, and that the US didn't go there for its own selfish reasons. It just went there to try and help out the South Vietnamese who were threatened by um, communism. and he's about as good as US presidents get, and he's still a complete cunt. So, sorry for the language, but, what a horrible thing to say. This is the same guy who, when William Kelly was convicted because he was a mass murderer who personally murdered a toddler and several other people and um, ordered his troops to massacre people. When he was convicted, Jimmy Carter was governor of Georgia, and he encouraged the people of Georgia to drive around all day with their headlights on to show their support for William Kelly. Charming, really, isn't it? Anyway, I was saying about how dehumanization works in empires. So the the problem with winning a war against a blue water empire is that you never really win. This is true here in Aotearoa as well. The British lost most wars they fought with Maori, in a way, something like the Waikato invasion was a Pyrrhic victory because they had to send an enormous army against some few hundreds of part-time warriors, and they did not exactly cover themselves in glory there at all. But again, it doesn't change the strategic realities. In fact, there's an interesting book called The Allure of Battle, which actually goes through and shows that battles are not that decisive. I can't remember the author, but it is quite an interesting one. So all of these historically decisive battles, they re-examine them and ask whether they were actually decisive in changing the strategic reality, and tend to find that they weren't. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a very interesting perspective. But I'm getting off track here. The main thing is that the strategic reality favors the blue water empire because it's always got this impervious back position rear position that can't be attacked, where most of their production and so forth is. So they fought these wars. The first two were against Hyder Ali, and then the second two were against his son, Tipu Sultan, who was apparently a bit of a zealot in terms of his religion, a religious zealot, and might not have treated minorities particularly well. But the thing is this, the East India Company had already conquered Bengal by this time and was well on their way to taking large swathes of territory, and they were projecting power into others. From our distance in history, well, people still discuss Tipu Sultan. He's still a hot topic. There's actually a book just recently come out trying to sort of balance the views. He is either seen as an intolerant atrocity monger, or he's seen as a valiant anti-British fighter. Obviously, there's probably both and neither of those things are true at the same time. So, but I mean, in the end, it doesn't actually matter. I mean, he would have been dead eventually anyway. The conquest of Mysore is far, far more significant than his character, one way or the other. And I would argue that the same is true in Syria. Once he was removed, it left open the worst things that could possibly happen to any people. The sorts of famines that happened under the British rule. Now, I'm not saying that famine would have been impossible without British rule, but the numbers who died were inconceivable without the behaviour of the British, who would still be exporting food while people are starving. Many people only survived because they would go to a local princely state that was still nominally independent, because there were some of them in the late 19th century famines, for example, which were not the only famines under British rule, because there was a Bengal famines before then as well. But they would go to a local princely state and be fed by the local Maharaja, because that person, again, like this is a monarch, but they were more democratic in their connection to the people than any British ruler could be. And we demonise someone like Tipu Sultan, and people still do to this day. He's often used as a byword for atrocities to this day. But yet, we don't really, the British had various administrators who might have been better or worse, but we neither demonise them for it, nor, in fact, does it really make any difference, because it was a system. It was an imperial system. An imperial system that, if the incentives were right, said that tens of millions of people should die. Now, that, to me, means more than whether or not someone was politically repressive. I don't want to suggest that the people who've suffered under the Assad regime are not valid in whatever they feel. If they want to dance in the streets, of course, more power to them. But I'm not. I'm a third party. I'm standing outside of this, and I have to act that way. I have to try and look at the bigger picture. I have a duty to be disinterested. And I think one of the things that I can't abide is people acting as if they were involved and using that almost to bully people who want to try and take a more dispassionate view, not because they believe in devaluing human life, not because they want to be some sort of realist who says that, a Stalin-like figure who just waves away millions of deaths, but because they want to be the antithesis of that. They want to be the person that says, my ideology, my personal beliefs do not justify any deaths. I don't pick sides and say that it's all right to kill people because the greater good is served by that. Now, people want us to celebrate, and again, those who do celebrate who are involved, that's fine. But the reality is, historical events are very seldom of the sort that should be celebrated. The sort of things that really change things, there are always going to be victims. Sometimes that's not true, but broadly speaking, that is true. And going back to this idea that, there are these pro-Assad people, Assad apologists, and Marxists, post-Marxists, Marxians, they have been labelled this a lot, and it's not because, I don't think any of them are doing it because they think that the Ba'ath Party is some wonderful socialist party that needs supporting. They might be inclined to have an ideological attachment to the secularism of the Ba'ath Party, because the fall of the Ba'ath Party is almost like the death of secularism in the Middle East now. And that is something in itself. I mean, that's well, I won't get into that topic. I've been going on long enough already, but I think it's because those people are more concerned with imperialism, and they take a more realist view of these things, and not as in the idea of an amoral realpolitik, but a realist view that looks at the broader structures. Now, I'm not even a Marxist. That's the thing. I'm not a Marxist. I'm not Marxian. I'm not post-Marxist. I'll happily put my hand up to being an anarchist. And the weird thing is, though, I suspect a lot of anarchists feel exactly the same way as me. The party line for anarchists, if you can talk about that, was actually to be very anti-Assad. And the reason for this is because of the nature of the autonomous region in Rojava, which set up systems, direct democratic systems based on ideas of confederalism coming from Murray Bookchin and so forth. And, Now, one of my few, well, possibly what may be my main claim to fame is that I was actually, David Graeber called me a racist on Twitter and blocked me for suggesting that welcoming US troops into Syrian territory was neither moral nor sensible. But the thing is, I'd love to believe in that project. I want that project to succeed, but I wasn't going to blind myself to the supervening realities just because I want it to be true. Well, we have had this in the past. The very reason that people started calling Marxists tankies was because they let their ideology blind them to the injustice of Soviet tanks going into Hungary and Prague and so forth. Now we have anarchist tankies, because that's exactly what they are. It's just like finding out during the build-up to the invasion of Iraq, a bit of an eye-opener for me as an atheist to find out that atheists could be religious zealots full of hatred. And in the end, that is the lesson we need to take, is that we can all be that way. It's not about ideology isn't the problem as such. It's about knowing its place in your heart and your head. It's fine to have an ideology, but you can't say that it justifies committing horrible acts for the greater good. And I think that there are people who tell us we have to be that you can't say bad things about a bunch of Islamists with an extremely dodgy background overthrowing the Syrian government because Assad was a bad dictator, man, and people in the prisons suffered blah, blah, blah. Those people are doing exactly what Zionists do when they point to atrocities that happened on October the 7th, or they talk about the hostages. They're saying, my atrocity means that you can't talk about other things, and it is a bullying technique. So, firstly, I would say don't buy into things. Don't buy into narratives. And secondly, I'd say if you start feeling good about things happening, then you're probably missing out. You don't understand what's going on. The good things in life come in very small packages. There's a reason why history is it's been referred to as a nightmare from which I cannot wake. It's mostly about the big bad things that are happening. Um, there are exceptions, of course, where the positives outweigh the negatives, but for the most part, you want to be happy, go for a walk in the forest. You know, don't read um, don't read about what's really happening in the news. And if the news is making you happy, it's not telling you the real news. Um, so yeah, I mean that's pretty much where I want to leave it. So now recommended reading. Now I mentioned the US role in the creation of the Khmer Rouge, and I also mentioned how new atheists. I didn't mention leftists in particular, but new atheists and leftists became true believers in the US imperial mission because of their Islamophobia during the global war on terror. One of those was William Shawcross. But back in the day when he used to be not an arsehole, he wrote a book called Sideshow, which detailed the horrors of the war that the US perpetrated in Cambodia, and of course its role in creating the Khmer Rouge and setting the country up for the further horrors that followed. Now, I also want to talk about, recommend, John Atkins Hobson's Imperialism, J.A. Hobson's Imperialism. He was apparently a bit of an anti-Semite, and I don't remember reading any anti-Semitic stuff in that book, but I might have skipped that bit or something like that. From my memory, he's talking about crony capitalism specifically, not not saying it belongs to a particular ethnicity or religious group or anything like that. However, I mean, if it is in there, I apologize. Anyway, the central thesis, though, is more interesting, and that is that at the time of the 19th century, the British Empire had become captured by sectional interests. Anyone who's heard of the idea of the military-industrial complex will actually sort of recognise that in what he's talking about, and I call it the empire complex. I think it is a better term for what we have today than the military-industrial complex because it is broader. So it's the certain manufacturing interests, the arms industry, the finance industry, and of course nowadays the petroleum industry, and it actually goes out a bit further as well. So. Talking about how it takes over the running of foreign policy, this empire complex, and it has its own logic and does its own thing for its own reasons. Now, this was a major inspiration for the next book I'm going to mention, which I'm not going to recommend, and that is Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. I really hate that book. He essentially kind of jumps in from where Hobson leaves off. Hobson was a liberal, and he was a critic of crony capitalism. He wasn't anti-capitalism or such. He wasn't a socialist or anything like that. But Lenin takes his ideas and kind of exploits them to fit into a Marxist framework. Now, the problem with it is that if you look at he calls this imperialism, but you can't say that it applies to the Roman Empire or to even the Spanish Empire, the early modern Spanish Empire, or the Chinese Empire. it really doesn't apply to any historical empire. He's looking at the sort of situation that Hobson's describing and saying this is the highest stage of capitalism, this is what imperialism is. But really, does imperialism have any meaning in that sense? It becomes a tautology. He's not really describing imperialism. He's actually fitting this current evolution of capital in the West into Marxist teleology, and then saying this is called imperialism. Yeah. So I dislike it partly because I don't like that aspect of it, but mainly because it's had, I think, a very detrimental effect on the way people have viewed imperialism since, because Marxists and Marxians have provided the most critiques of imperialism, but they have put it into that framework. And I find that extremely problematic, and I think it has really undermined anti-imperial struggles in the world. Now, having said that, though, I just want to credit the Marxists for, I mean, there's lots I could credit Marxists for. I really appreciate you all. You do some good work. But I particularly want to point out Michael Hudson's super imperialism, because he is a Marxist-Leninist who's kind of taking inspiration from Lenin here, and he writes this fantastic book looking at the financial structure of imperialism in the US today. So I highly recommend that book. I've in the past I've said that Lenin's imperialism is like a pile of shit, and Hudson's super imperialism is like a beautiful flower growing out of that, which lost me followers on Twitter, but oh well. Anyway, last thing I would mention is Mike Davis's Late Victorian Holocausts, which covers the impacts and the banal cruelty of the British rule, the unnecessary death caused by it. I mean, a more human system might not have let anyone die, or certainly, numbers, maybe 1% of the number of people who died in the late 19th century famines. So yeah, it's it's a bit of a brutal read, but it is well worth it. And of course, he is more broadly edifying than simply that. It's not just about that narrow topic. It uses that as a leaping off point. It's about climate. It's about political economy. It's liberalism. It's about all sorts of things. It is a brilliant book, and you ought to read it. All right, so that's all I have to say, and I will see you next time. Bye.